Right, well, I think now is the time to begin. Thank you very much. Welcome to Trending Treasury, our weekly webcast from Arling Close. Been doing these for quite a while now, and so hopefully most of you, this won't be the first time attending, but if it is, we've been doing these relatively regularly, putting together anything that's episodes on anything to do with local authority treasury, local authority capital finance, and today we're going to be looking at the Prudential Code, and I'm joined by David Green, Dr. David Green, our strategic director at Arling Close, a member of SIPFA, and an all-round font of all knowledge. David, how are you?
Good morning. I'm very well, thanks, Stephen. Just gobsmacked by the introduction.
Well, you know, if you know, no need to hide your light under a bushel, David. So today we're going to be talking about the SIPFA Prudential Code. It doesn't seem very long since we had an update. You know, it's 2017, the last update to the code. It's out for consultation. What's it all about? Why are they doing this? If we only had an update in 2017? Why the need for one? You know, relatively short time later.
Well, clearly it's been the growth of commercial property investments by local authorities that's been the driver for this, and maybe a few other types of investment along the side as well. But I mean, that was the reason for the 2017 update, which was, you know, came out the sort of the working day before Christmas in 2017. So really only been in effect for 2 years. But there've been further reviews, and the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee have both looked at commercial property again in the last year and a half, and really have said SIPFA and the governments, you know, particularly the government in England, so the MHCLG, need to do more to clamp down on it. So that's broadly why we're here.
So basically, they tried it in 2017 and they've come back for another go in 2021.
Yeah, that's a reasonable summary.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because overall, we've had a lot of discussion about commercial property. We've had the big change to the Public Works Loan Board, which if you do want to hear some thoughts on that, for those of you listening, we do have a webcast on that subject that goes into a lot of detail. But we've had changes to BWB, which are clearly designed to prevent local authorities, or at least actively and clearly discourage local authorities from investing in commercial property. And now we've got the Prudential Code. The big lever they seem to be using is this clause on borrowing in advance of need. So, I mean, the big question they've got is that they're changing local authorities may not borrow in advance of need purely to invest in local commercial property, may not purely to profit from it. Now we're changing to primarily to profit from it. Is this a lever that's going to work? And you know, when we're looking at the consultation response, I know a lot of our listeners will be putting together their consultation response at the moment. You know, are there any issues with trying to use this lever, and are there any things that Arling Close thinks needs to be clarified?
Well, it's interesting, because, you know, SIPFA are agreeing themselves it needs clarification. They're proposing to add a sentence: this means that local authorities may not borrow to buy investments. But you know, that's much more straightforward than this borrowing in advance of need and primarily for a certain purpose. I don't think people really understand. I'm not even sure SIPFA understands what they mean by borrowing in advance of need. I mean, the Scottish Government knows what it means by borrowing in advance of need, and it defines it as, broadly speaking, borrowing in advance of borrowing more than the CFR. But of course, you buy a commercial property that adds to your CFR, you can borrow for it. So SIPFA clearly has a different idea of what the needs to borrow is, but doesn't seem very good at expressing what that is. So, you know, if that's going to be a problem, they should just get rid of this concept of borrowing in advance of need and say you can't borrow to buy property, or, you know, to buy an investment property, to incur and to make any other investment. I suppose this should have both capital and non-capital ones. I think we initially thought it was all it was all about non-capital. So it's about, you can borrow up to CFR because that's for capital expenditure, but you can't borrow even more just to have cash investments and hope that you can put these on deposit at a higher rate than you can borrow at. And clearly, when the code first came out, you could borrow at 5% and invest at 6% quite happily. Times are different now, and generally it's more expensive to borrow and invest, which is why people have gone into making capital investments, I guess, where you potentially can earn more cost of borrowing. Although you might think the pandemic has sort of shown the risks to that approach, and I do wonder if they're trying to shut this stable door after the horse has bolted now, after the stables caught fire, maybe.
It does seem quite surprising that SITFA have chosen to go through this. I'll speak frankly. I'm a SITFA member. Hopefully I can get away with it. It does seem quite surprising that they've gone down this convoluted borrowing in advance of need approach, trying to fiddle with that, saying, well, you can't borrow in advance of need, and you don't need to make commercial investments, so borrowing for commercial investments must be borrowing in advance of need. Why have they gone down that route rather than what I would seem to be the cleaner and I think I don't want to speak for our clients, but I think which would be more helpful for our clients, a more clear direction of you can't do this. Why have they felt the need not to be explicit? Why have they tried to tweak this past the things that are already there?
I'm not sure in SITFA's point of view, actually. I mean, clearly it's a phrase that was in the Prudential Code from the start. I guess it's probably quite a key part of how they think about it, which is, I say, is not borrowing more than CFR in order to hold extra cash investments. I think they're probably wedded to the old idea of it. I don't think SITFA's got any sort of is trying deliberately to be oblique. You could accuse the government of doing that, maybe. Mm-hmm. Government, on the one hand, it doesn't want local authorities taking excessive risks. On the other hand, it does want them being self-sufficient and being more commercial. So you can almost see why the government's isn't very clear on it, but I don't think you could ascribe that motive to SITFA.
If I was to be mischievous, I might say that they're doing it so that they can claim that it was always in the Prudential Code from the very beginning that you shouldn't be doing this, and that all they're doing is clarifying a position that they already had, and that if they feel the need to, if they were to be completely explicit with regard to the wording, it would be sort of an admission that the previous versions of the Prudential Code were relatively silent on commercial profit-making investment. But that would be me being mischievous, not me. I don't know if you have any views on that.
Maybe, but I think, come back to the point you said a little bit earlier, I think what most of our clients want, what most local authorities want, is clarity on what they can and shouldn't do, and what they must do if they're going to follow a certain route. And we've distributed our response to the consultation, but I've put an appendix in there, and the guidance is not clear. So the Prudential Code says currently, local authorities must not borrow more than or advance of their needs purely in order to profit best which sums borrowed. But in the guidance notes of the Prudential Code, it just says local authorities should not borrow in advance of need, full stop. And then in the Treasury Management Code, local authorities or organisations should only borrow in advance of need where there is a clear business case for doing so. But in the Treasury Code guidance notes, you should never borrow for the purpose of making investment return. It's all, they keep using different words and with different meanings in places, and that's without what the definition of an investment is. Some codes, property is an investment, some codes it's not. The accounting code's got a different definition. It's all a hodgepodge, and really think we need clarity on exactly what SITFA says they can and can't do.
Do you think that in that case, some clients, when they're responding to the code consultation, some so using some of these examples of a lack of clarity, and perhaps where some of the where some of these things, shall we say, contradict each other, that would be a good place for some of our clients to start with their responses. Obviously, there's the questions that are in there, but this is supposed to be, my understanding, reading the consultation originally, that this was supposed to be a broad approach. This was supposed to be the start of a process. So perhaps making it clear that what we need, and I think what the sector wants, is consistency across different documents and clarity, really.
Indeed, yeah. CIPFA have said it's a two-stage process. So they're, in theory, they're consulting on the sort of broad brush principles of this consultation. And then there'll be another one in the summer or the autumn with the sort of text of the new code. Having said that, this consultation does include quite a lot of text, sort of proposed text for new codes anyway, but I guess that gives you an idea of what they're looking at. But yeah, I mean, this is the opportunity for local authorities to be clear in what they want from their guidance. I'm sure it won't all be the same. There'll be people who want free rein to do absolutely anything. There'll be people who think buying any commercial property is completely a silly idea and it should be banned in all circumstances, and probably a bulk of people somewhere in the middle. And of course, within authorities, there'll be different views as well on this. So it can be difficult to come to a consolidated view of the authority, I guess.
I mean, sorry.
Yeah, and CIPFA's job isn't particularly easy in bringing all that together and doing something which meets, but I guess CIPFA's got responsibility for what the public expects as well, haven't they? Or what Parliament, sort of National Audit Office, the Public Accounts Committee expect of local government, because it is public money in the end, and I think CIPFA's taking that view as well as just representing the local authorities. It's a difficult position for them, I'll grant them that, certainly.
I mean, as it stands, and it's actually difficult to see, and I think we'll move on to another element of the Prudential Code and consultation in a moment, but as it stands, even though there are these therefore this means, the actual code itself, the changes that are being suggested, to be blunt, still don't give the clarity of you can't invest in commercial property. Again,
you've frozen a bit there, Stephen. But, yeah, I think what you're saying. Oh, you're back. Yeah, you froze a bit there. But,
oh, sorry. I was just going to say what specific things would clients perhaps like to see if we're not going to get that explicit no to commercial property? What would we like to see perhaps within the within that borrowing in advance of need part, which would give us the clarity? Obviously, defining need is the big one.
Yeah, I think so. Just clarity, and I think it's difficult for maybe to come up with that. But yeah, I mean, we've considered, can you have an investment CFR? Would that work? As so you can borrow up to your non-investment CFR. But then of course you can also borrow. We don't want to stop people borrowing for treasury management reasons. So I've got a project, I don't need the cash till next year when the bills come in, but I need to sign up for the project now. We know we can afford today's borrowing rate. We don't necessarily know if we can afford it in a year's time, so we want to borrow the money now. There are risks to that approach, but that's a normal treasury management borrowing in advance of need for risk management rather than borrowing in advance of need for profit. Yeah. So it doesn't drop that out of the equation.
Our colleague David Blake has made an interesting point within the chat box. So if anybody else has any questions or any comments to make, please do stick them in. But David's pointed out that HMT has basically defined permitted and prohibited activity with actual examples of investments that are investments field that they won't fund within the Public Works Loan Board and that would lock you out of the Public Works Loan Board. Would a similar approach of actually giving examples and actually giving clear examples and clear categories of investment be similarly helpful from CIPFA?
Yeah, probably. I mean, examples can never cover the whole gamut, and maybe it goes to but I think there is a whole scale of it's not black and white, is it? What's there are some things which are definitely a service project and some things which are clearly an investment, and there is a lot in the middle. I think it's so examples can certainly help there. But of course, it's wider than property, isn't it? They've got to cover borrowing for cash and borrowing to borrowing for revenue purposes. It's trying to cover up all that as well. Whereas Treasury seems to be very focused on buying commercial property as opposed to anything else.
So to move on, sort of to some of the other, perhaps less glamorous or less exciting parts of the consultation, there's obviously the question around and the proposal of bringing proportionality into your commercial investments. I'll be honest with you, David, when I read through this, I was a bit confused, because I've just read the first section, which was all about not investing in commercial property, and then we had a little bit of a section saying that they should be proportional, and I was thinking, well, proportional could mean that perhaps I should invest lots of money in commercial property, because then that'll give me a nice healthy income stream to pay for services and to cover the losses on incomes on commercial properties that don't perform. So I was a bit confused. Can you shed a bit of light for me? I mean, I know you've read this in much more detail than I have, and help me be less confused.
Well, it's interesting they said it should be proportionate to budgets. I think what you've suggested there, the danger is, this is my budget gap is £4 million. I think I can invest at 4%, therefore I need 100 million commercial property to fill the budget gap. That's clearly not what they mean. I must be being a little mischievous there. I mean, don't forget, it's everyone's got the problem with local authorities borrowing money to invest. So no one's got a problem with local authorities investing their own money. And if they want to put that in commercial property, that's as good an investment class as anything else. Of course, what I've put in our response is, if you can't borrow for a commercial investment, then it's automatically going to be proportionate, because you're going to be limited to your reserves and working capital that generate cash for you, less the amounts you need to keep in liquid investments. So in a way, it'll already be proportionate if you can't borrow. Obviously, that will be for going forward. Clearly, for how they're going to handle what people have done in the past is maybe another issue. Is this a driver to get people to sell existing investments, maybe, rather than just stopping additional purchases in the future?
I mean, that would seem I mean, I'll be honest, that's the only way that I read it, and it be clear to me that it be an attempt to encourage local authorities, shall we say, to rebalance their portfolios away from, and those that have got large commercial property exposure to reduce that. However, it seems to be it's the old joke, isn't it, where people buy at the top and then sell at the bottom, and it seems to be trying to push local authorities into reducing their exposure at a time when valuations are under extreme pressure. I mean, we had Paul Hanam from the CCLA on Trending Treasury recently, and he was very clear that that in a lot of areas that valuations are under pressure, but that gradually he expected to see them return. I mean, he would say that because he's a commercial fund manager, but it does seem to be a strange time to be trying to push local authorities down that route if they've especially if those investments are still performing. So I don't know, is there a way that proportionality could be made cleaner, or do you think it's again a matter of for not wanting to be too prescriptive and just saying, well, we need to think about making sure it's proportional, rather than just saying, well, you shouldn't have done this and sell it all?
Yeah, indeed. And they don't seem any wish to set a level that is proportionate. Is 10% of gross revenue expenditure, or 30% of the balance sheet, or whatever, or just not to be bigger than anyone else, which obviously is impossible because someone's always going to be the largest. Doesn't seem to be any indication at all of what might be disproportionate. So if it's going to be completely left up to each authority's discretion as to what is a proportionate level. You know, people will think their existing stuff is proportionate because it's working for them so far. You know, it's not caused us any problems so far. We've been through a big economic crisis, and we're still getting more income than our borrowing costs. And our MRP, assuming we are actually making MRP, you know, all is good. Let's carry on. So, yeah, some definition of what, or guidelines as to what proportionate is. Maybe, you know, not a fixed number, but again, I'm sure local authorities would appreciate guidance. You know, some sort of idea, rather than just waiting. You know, anything that doesn't make the newspapers is proportionate, is it? Or anything that doesn't, you know, raise someone's hackles and result in your investigative journalism, or the SIPFA board members having a go, or you know, who knows.
Anything that doesn't get us shouted at basically is good, and anything that gets us shouted at is bad. To again, perhaps be a little bit facetious, but again, moving to a different section of the and perhaps moving to a place where we can be a bit more positive, is the suggestion that the liability benchmark be included within the code and be required as an indicator. Clients of Arling Close will be hopefully very familiar with the liability benchmark. Do you want to just talk through very briefly what we think it's used for, what SIPFA seems to think it's used for, and how we feel about it being included in the code?
Yes, I mean, it came about, it's actually very unfortunate timings. SIPFA brought a paper on interest rate risk management up in the summer of 2008. And of course, about 2 months later, we had the big financial crisis, and the Icelandic banks failed, and you know, everyone forgot about interest rate risk, and credit risk was the only thing people were worried about for years. They did bring it up again in the SIPFA risk management toolkit, which I think was about 2014. But again, it was one of about more than 50 sets of indicators and charts they suggested. You know, but it was certainly the one that we thought was meaningful. So it's something where you, the simplest thing, you compare your actual debt to your CFR, so your capital financing requirement, i.e. the underlying need to borrow for capital purposes. But the idea of the liability benchmark is to be an underlying need to borrow for all purposes. So to deduct off, most people have got an underlying need to invest, if you like, due to working capital surplus. So the cash is received before it's spent, the fact they hold reserves. So it's all netting that natural amount of cash off the natural amount of borrowing to give an underlying need to borrow for all purposes, like a low risk, a minimum risk level of borrowing. So it needs a few assumptions built into that, as well as direct off the balance sheet. And the idea is the liability benchmark could be shown in graphical format for at least 10 years. So, you know, have a line for a debt, or we tend to have a sort of a shaded area for debt, a line for the CFR, and a line for this liability benchmark going forward. And we very much thought, you know, if local authorities make 50-year borrowing decisions, some people have borrowed 70-year loans. Some authorities still have loans that mature in the 2080s on their balance sheet. You know, you probably need to have an understanding of what your need to borrow over that period of time is. So making decisions on actual borrowing against a forecast need to borrow, being completely open that forecast will change. It's only ever going to be today's best guess, but that's better than doing it in completely blind, surely. So yeah, so we're very supportive of the concept of liability benchmark, and yeah, it's been around for long enough to be a formal indicator by now.
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit surprised that they described it as an affordability indicator. As you say, they seem to think of it as being an indicator of whether your debt's affordable. Now, whether they're seeing that in the context of interest rate risk or in affordability in, you know, the amount of debt that you're taking on, but it doesn't really, because it doesn't show you the proportion, the size of the debt compared to your budget or to your balance sheet or to your I&E. It's I find it difficult to use as an affordability indicator, and actually I see it more of as a risk management tool. Looking at, well, what's our refinancing? It tells you quite a lot in a short space of time. It shows you, your refinancing risk. It shows you, to a certain extent, your interest rate risk. It also, shows you a few other things. So I don't know if your view is similar.
Yes, yeah, it's not. I mean, it can be turned into an affordability indicator, and we do that for clients by saying what would happen if we borrowed, where borrowing is above the liability benchmark, if we invested that at short-term rates, and if borrowing is below the liability benchmark, what if we borrowed the deficit at short-term rates? And that gives you an exposure to interest rate risk. Shows you, and clearly, if you include in the actual cost of your current borrowing, that forecast your actual cost of borrowing. That's the affordability indicator. And so I do know clients who would then add on, their aim is to keep borrowing costs at 4% of revenue budget, so they can show that line on the chart as well. Yeah, so it can be moved into that, but yeah, the basic liability benchmark is really it's a risk measure, isn't it? It's you say refinancing risk or reinvestment risk when we've got too much borrowing, credit risk when we've got too much borrowing. The cash has to be lent out somewhere. It's that sort of measure, really.
Well, great. I mean, I'm just looking at the time and looking at actually the chat, and we've had a good little discussion within the chat, which is excellent. I mean, we've had one comment which suggests that perhaps because if we look at the Public Works Loan Board guidance being quite clear, which obviously is appreciated by authorities, the suggestion that actually the proposed change at this stage is actually just a holding position before we go through yet another review by SIPFA. So we'd have the 2017 review, the 2021 review, and then perhaps the 2022 or 2023 review. Do you think that that's a likely situation? Do you think that's a helpful situation? I mean, we also had a comment that said it's quite unlikely that whether they're helpful or not, that SIPFA would provide examples simply to avoid being too prescriptive.
Well, I certainly hope we're not going for a further review. SIPFA surely, and one of the reasons it's doing a two-stage consultation process must be to have more chance of getting this right for the longer term. I mean, other issues will come up in future that it is a bit of being backwards looking, isn't it? What's gone wrong? The Treasury Management Code of Practice came in because of problems back in the 1980s with what local authorities were doing. So it's all quite reactive from time to time, and maybe some of that's inevitable. We see that with lots of things government do. Wouldn't it be good if we could be very clear? I think examples to show exemplify what the thinking is. But there's an awful wide range of things that local authorities do. We've got people buying companies, people setting up banks, local authorities and trading companies, shared services. Some that's through a joint committee, sometimes that's through a company. So that's shares in the company, loans to the company. People buying parts of their PFI, special purpose vehicles. These are all investments of some sort. I think it's very difficult to be prescriptive for all eventualities, isn't it? So, and the examples will really leave gaps where there are things that aren't examples for. No doubt. So.
Hard cases make bad law, as our legal friends say, and I think that's also one of the issues. We're trying to create broad principles that can be applied, but there's always going to be, I suppose, even with the clarity that the Public Works Loan Board tried to provide, there's still the issue around people looking at individual projects and saying, well, is this project, does this project housing? Oh, well, this project is to a regeneration project, but it also makes a profit. Does that make it yield generating? And I think that I think this is a good place to, perhaps, unless there are any questions from the listeners and from clients today, it might be a good place to leave it and say, well, actually it is quite a difficult thing that they're trying to do here. There is, you know, almost an infinite number of different investments and different approaches that they're needing to take in account of. So yeah, I will give just a moment to check that there are no further questions before we let you go back to the day job, David. But whilst we're waiting, I'll just say thank you very much. That's, as always, it's been very informative and very helpful. And thank you everybody for joining us today. These are obviously a weekly occurrence, and we will be continuing to do them long after we're all out of lockdown and long after we're all released from this. Next week we will have my colleague Nick discussing with Mark Dennison, who's a legal expert, around looking at the Public Works Loan Board and some of that clarity the Public Works Loan Board has given us, and how it's going to work, and how we can go ahead over the future looking at some projects and how those projects can be funded. So we haven't had any further questions, so I'll just say thank you again to David, and thank you again to everybody else, and thank you for listening, and have a good Easter. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks, Stephen. Goodbye, everyone.